One of the things that made Tyson Fury's comeback so powerful is that the whole arc was a perfect metaphor for a painful period many of us face. Climbing into that ring, he represented a man coming back from the brink of destruction, having destroyed all the important things in his life. The decision aside, for me this was the final act in the story of him regaining those things. What made it so resonant is that even though this was an arc many people can relate to, it was an extreme example of that arc. If your life is ups and downs, then it was hard not to be moved by Tyson's comeback. It was a story of many people's lives, and so his return represented hope. If he can turn his big fat gypsy ship around, then so can you. Nobody wants to see a guy go through hell, but the fact that he did made his comeback simply inspirational. In a similar way, Francis Ngannou's story exemplifies another universal, another difficult period many people have to endure. Just like Fury, it's made all the more resonant because it is such an extreme example. In Francis' case, it's the idea of not wanting to live the path of least resistance, not wanting the life that society has prescribed or that circumstance dictates. I already played this clip in part 1, but I'm going to play it again here because it's a big part of what Ngannou and his road to the UFC represents.
Enough is enough. I'm not just gonna survive in the life. I'm gonna live. I'm gonna chase the dream.
Now, where Francis comes from, the term survive does have a literal interpretation. But that sense of simply surviving is not unique to people living below the breadline. It's a universal experience. There's people all over the world, in every walk of life, who are living an existence that feels no more satisfying or fulfilling than simply surviving. There's a lot of square pegs out there. Big cities are full of them. People stuck in jobs they hate, paying exorbitant rents, and thinking the exact same things Francis was thinking. Does any of this make sense? I'm working a job that makes me miserable so that I can just about afford this frankly absurd rent in order to keep getting into a job that's making me miserable. You can feel like you're busting your ass to perpetuate an unfulfilling cycle of misery. This is the plight of the square pegs of this world, who struggle to fit in and find meaning in society. You see it all the time, especially in men of a certain age. They see their lives slipping away, and they make abrupt career changes. They start businesses. They take massive risks. And there's always going to be obstacles. It's not going to be easy. There's skills to be learned, often massive challenges to overcome. But if things work out, the very least you will get at the other end is a life less ordinary than the one you had, and the satisfaction of knowing that you yourself are responsible for that. The reasons Francis' life is such an extreme and perfect example of this universal sentiment are twofold. Firstly, as I outlined in part 1, the life he envisioned for himself, his goal was simply so grandiose, it was ridiculous. He was in his mid-20s with basically no experience, and he was thinking he'd be a world champion. Understandably, people laughed in his face. The second reason, which I'm about to look at in this video, is that in order to even get to a reasonable starting point, the obstacles and challenges that would present themselves to Francis would to many seem completely insurmountable. Francis was about to explore the full extent of the nightmare through which clinging to a dream can sustain you. And that sentence, in a nutshell, is the inspirational message Francis and his story would come to embody.
I've been through a lot. I've been through hell.
So what made it hell for you?
Everything.
When Francis recovered from his illness, he rededicated himself to his dream. He knew that in order to have any chance of making it a reality, he would have to make the arduous journey to Europe. He decided to forego any farewells in order to save his family massive worry. He left Cameroon without telling a soul.
I didn't say bye to my family even, because when you're gonna say bye, they're gonna say, where are you going? You are supposed to give them a destination, some place, a location. But I didn't know by myself, so I can't give them nothing. I don't know what's gonna happen there. I don't know if I'm gonna survive or not. I don't know how long I'm gonna be back, or if ever I'm gonna be back.
Francis took a bus to Nigeria, then traveled through Niger, Algeria, before reaching Morocco, which is where the fun really began. Morocco is a popular tourist destination, and Ngannou brought his flip-flops. He had a blast. Water parks, cocktails, sun, sea, and sand. Oh, no, wait a second. Actually, he lived in a forest, like an animal, basically, hiding in the woods, eating out of trash cans, or hunting his lunch like a true predator in the wild.
6 years ago, I was in Morocco. Sometimes we live in the forest.
Did you have food?
No, sometimes
How did you eat?
Sometimes we have to go hunt. Sometimes we have to go trash truck. In Morocco, immigration, you don't have right. You don't have no right. First of all, right for nothing. You can work, you can live in the house, nothing, and then they are no respect you.
His main priority was avoiding the police. If they catch you in Morocco, they don't deport you. Now, they've got a special little treat in store.
We have to hide because we didn't know who was the police or not. And there was like in regular clothes sometime.
How close were you ever to getting caught?
Oh, they caught us a lot. So they caught us there. When they caught you there, they didn't send you back in your country, but they send you in the desert.
Desert?
From the desert, you have to find a way. But
How many times did they send you back into the desert?
many times.
Wow.
They take you out and dump your ass in the middle of the desert. So, between extended periods of living like an animal in the forest, he was apprehended many times and dumped in the desert with total disregard. I mean, I don't know the exact details, but I'd imagine if you're leaving someone in the desert, you're fully aware that there's at least a possibility that that's the end of their story. But Ngannou would always make it back to the forest. And that forest was just outside the Spanish enclave of Melilla, which is where Francis was headed. But it's protected in quite a serious fashion. Separating Melilla from Morocco is a huge fence, which is monitored 24/7 with infrared cameras, motion sensors, and watchtowers that make it possible to respond to a breach within a minute.
This fence, which is actually 3 separate fences, traces the border of Melilla. It runs about 7 miles long and has recently been fortified, made higher and much harder to climb. There are motion sensors, spotlights, and cameras along the perimeter. Spain's border patrol officers showed us the high-tech cameras that track body heat. These moving dots are actually lines of migrants traversing the Moroccan forest, waiting for the right time to cross.
Now, even though that sounds highly efficient, totally intimidating, and somewhat sinister, that technology pales in comparison to the most hazardous component, the coiled razor wire that sits atop the fence, concertinas. The wire of the concertinas can cause cuts, skin tear, blood loss, and in extreme cases can lead to death. There's cases of guys getting stuck in the concertinas for hours. Now, they've since been removed. They were seen as an ineffective and unnecessarily cruel deterrent, but they were still there in Francis' time. And on this subject, he said the following: "The barbed wire of Melilla I will never forget. I have scars everywhere." So, as I said, fun, fun, fun. The fun, it never stops. It's like he was living in a trip designed by that creepy fucking villain from the Saw franchise, and it just keeps getting worse. The ultimate goal of this torturous expedition was to board a state-of-the-art, first-class rubber dinghy and take that from Melilla to Spain. The first time Francis made it this far, he was surprised to learn that the passengers on his voyage would be paddling with their hands, or hand paddling, I think the experts call it. Since we did not have a paddle, the man who was leading the ship told us to paddle with our hands. I thought to myself, people die at sea when they have oars, and this guy wants me to paddle with my hands? But Francis would not be disheartened. He almost took the attitude of, hey, I didn't want oars in the first place. Oars are for losers. If I had them, I'd throw them away. He says, I even thought we'll go down in history. We'll be the first to reach Spain paddling with our hands. I mean, Jesus Christ, there's no dissuading this guy. He certainly got the right attitude, but that was madness. Imagine setting out into the abyss, trying to cross from Morocco to Spain in this piece of shit, with no means of control or propulsion. I mean, that's insanity. I'd say after about 2 hours, you'd be thinking, okay guys, who's gonna eat who?
And I didn't know how it's gonna end up out there, because people die. You're going in the ocean.
Is that a life preserver?
Yeah, and you don't know what's gonna happen.
On that occasion, their boat was spotted, and the crew, I'd assume, were dumped right back in the desert. It took Ngannou a total of 7 attempts over 14 months to finally make it across the sea to Spain. Now, if my calculations are correct, that means he failed 6 times. 6 times he waited in the forest, living like a savage, trying unsuccessfully to avoid the police and a trip to the desert. Before he made a break for it, shredded his ass scaling the hazardous razor wire of Melilla, took the insane risk of boarding a rubber dinghy to hell, only to get picked up by immigration and dumped right back in the middle of the fucking desert. 6 times, with no guarantees it wouldn't take another 6 tries, or 16 tries, or 60 fucking tries. Despite all that, the guy was never so disheartened that he gave up. He never threw in a towel.
In the winter, a lot of people quit because stay in the forest in the winter with no food, sometimes no clothes, is damn sucks.
Eventually, his dogged perseverance was rewarded. On his 7th attempt, his dinghy was picked up by the Red Cross and brought to Tarifa, Spain. As soon as he made it to Europe, things immediately began to improve. Oh, no, wait a second. He was actually sent straight to jail for illegal immigration. Come on now, you didn't think it'd be that easy. Although, considering where he was coming from, Francis probably thought he was in a 5-star hotel. But as there's no repatriation agreement between Spain and Cameroon, after 2 months he was released. And with his release, at least one part of his journey was finally over. At the end of that harrowing ordeal, he had nothing. He knew nobody. He had nowhere to live. But he had reached Europe and was finally free to chase his dream.
Roule un gros pilon, rouge au fond des yeux en dilon. La chambre et j'écharpe, je pars en guerre des terres comme César. Je reconnais que le ventre que j'ai quitté, ma vélocité vient de Kunta Kinte. Reconnais qu'une arme peut nous acquitter, et l'animal grâce à sa pile.
His next stop was Paris. Francis does France. But when he got there, he was a little surprised. It's not the land of milk and honey he expected. The conditions in the homeless shelter were a little dirty. Now, Francis didn't care about the conditions, but what did bother him was the attitudes of the other migrants. As we know, Francis was sustained by a dream. It seems some of these guys endured their journey through hell because they thought when they got to France, they'd move right into the Palace of Versailles. Powdered wigs, Fabergé eggs, pantaloons. You know, let him eat cake, the whole 9 yards.
Do you know what she said?
Let them eat cake.
Such nonsense. I would never say that.
There's a funny disorder experienced by Asian tourists visiting Paris. Because there's such a discrepancy between the reality of Paris and the romantic ideal of Paris presented in media and films, they can have a full psychiatric meltdown. I mean, that's a real thing. It seems like there's a similar thing going on with these guys. They get off the bus and they're like, OMG, this is not what I was expecting. Excuse me? I'm lactose intolerant. I said no cream in my mochaccino. Jesus Christ. You know what? Take me back to my rubber dinghy. I'm gonna go ahead and hand paddle straight to Scandinavia or something. They were bitching and moaning, and Francis didn't like it. So again, he felt like a bit of an outsider, and he left the shelter to sleep in a parking lot. You know, one of the major headlines that was later put out by multiple outlets was the idea that Francis went from homeless to the UFC. And that's quite the contrast. It's a great headline. But I think the bizarre fact that sleeping on the street was voluntary and the rationale behind that decision is even more interesting than the state of homelessness itself. Francis is a surprising source of quotes and sound bites. He's an insightful guy. But this, at least for me, this is just sensational.
So when I went in Paris, I saw some parking garage. I went there, just sleep in the floor in the parking garage. It was in the springtime. So it was cold, but so just the idea to feel the freedom. I don't have to scare when I sleep in tonight to say, hey, military might surprise us and catch us to throw us in the desert. I feel really free when you walk at the street and didn't think you have to check about everybody, like this might be the military, that might be one of them, that might be, just walk free. That feeling is greater than everything, the feeling of freedom. I saw people that was like showing mercy, like it might be hard to be homeless. Oh my God, I was like, hey, please stop, don't show mercy in my life, please. My life is doing pretty good. I'm like, I think I can bet that I'm happier than you. It was the most exciting time in my life. I was happier that time. I was homeless with nothing, but I was happy to get in that area that I can have my personal opportunity. Most of people, when they went in from Africa to Europe, they get surprised. They have the star in their eyes, like, oh, wow. But I didn't expect like that. My only concern was about to have my opportunity. Then I'm gonna prove myself. People was like, okay, hold on, step, Paris might not be the heaven that you thought when you was in Africa or something like that. Then I was like, don't care. I'm not expecting meet a heaven somewhere. I'm not expecting that there are a heaven land in this world, but I just think you can build your own, and I'm gonna build my own.
It seems for a lot of those migrants, Europe was the final destination, and so they were underwhelmed. For Francis, this wasn't the final destination. In fact, he was only at the start of his journey, and he was ecstatic for the opportunity to finally begin. It really is a difference between having a goal or feeling like you have a purpose in life and being hopeless. So, not wanting to succumb to the negativity of the shelter, he elected to live alone on the streets. I went there once, but I felt too much negativity, and I didn't want to be discouraged. I knew it wouldn't help me move forward and would slow down my momentum. I wasn't here to live a life of misery, but to conquer. If I was discussing any other fighter or almost any individual, and I reached a part of their story where they were homeless, it would almost certainly represent catastrophe, rock bottom, possibly mental illness, some issues with addiction. But for Francis, this was the happiest time of his life. And I love this idea because I totally agree with the sentiment. You just cannot overstate the value of having a deep-rooted goal and feeling like you're taking positive strides towards it. When you have that in life, as Francis has shown, you can be completely happy living in a parking lot. It can sustain you through some tough fucking times.
Those paths make the man I am today, and then it make me stronger.
Another point that's worth making here is a theme that's run through this guy's entire life, and that's solitude. I don't want to make assumptions about his personal experience, but it appears to me he has walked an extremely lonely path. As a total outsider, he's almost the platonic ideal of a square peg in society. In part 1, I described how, as a child, he moved around a lot, which meant he got bullied or ostracized, and never really formed close bonds. As he grew up and began to discuss his goals in life, he was laughed at. People thought he was crazy, to the point that when he finally decided to leave for Europe, he did so without telling anyone. He was alone both in a physical sense and in terms of, solidarity. Just imagine him leaving on a bus, thinking that he might never see his family, might never again see his mother. And they don't even know that. He didn't even get to say goodbye because he wanted to carry that burden by himself. In the forest of Morocco, there were others, but Francis described it as there were others, but it was every man for himself.
It's not like being with a group of people. You guys met there, and then everyone goes his way, you know.
In other words, you were on your own. Then he gets to Paris, has accommodation, but because he feels like an outsider, because he wants to avoid the negativity of hopeless men, he elects to forgo a roof over his head in order to be alone with his own ambition. This is the loneliest path I've ever looked at on this channel. Very often, fighters' stories are impossible to untangle from their mentors. Their careers were fostered and encouraged by others. Francis was not only alone, but it appears to me he had never had a reliable source of encouragement, which, when you consider what he's going through here, is insane. People talk about Francis' physicality. Oh, he relies on his power. He's a gifted athlete. But I think when you take a good long look at this guy, he has psychological attributes that far outshine any physical gifts he may have been given. This is not just a remarkable athlete. This is a very unique and remarkable individual. I mean, there's just no two ways about it.